Okay, so this morning we'll be talking about some practices for daily living based on what I've been presenting since the beginning of the seminar. And this really is the essence of what I wanted to bring to you. Everything else is theory, and theory is always interesting and endlessly fascinating, especially when there are complex charts to study. Really, we have to bring the rubber to the road, as I remember hearing Floyd say when we were speaking at one point, and that means practice. So, essentially, what I want you to know is how to achieve the mind of the master. I don't mean by that going through initiations, I don't mean by that becoming a master. What I mean by that is living in that direction, pointing yourself in the direction of a higher level of fulfillment for yourself and through a higher level of service to the world. And I believe this is the basis of the teachings of initiation, regardless of the levels and the characteristics that I've been talking about all weekend. But as you know, everybody, in my belief, has a particular flavor of service. We won't be talking much about that today because these practices, I believe, are helpful for everyone, regardless of which path you're on. The path of the mystic, or the path of the empath, or the path of the seer. So let's begin, once again, by recalling the words of Annie Besant on the mind of the masters. I put this here so that once you get all of the attachments I'll be sending you, and there will probably be about 15 PDFs of various kinds, including PDFs of the slides and a couple of texts that I promised you. One was an Annie Besant lecture called The Masters and the Way to Them, which is a very inspiring lecture. Another was a selection of pages from a book called A Short History of the Theosophical Society that has some of the clearest information about the Theosophical Masters gathered in one place. And then I want to point out also that the basic spiritual practice that we did the other night is in here, but in a somewhat different application, and then some extensions of that. Essentially a basic practice, an intermediate practice, and an advanced practice. We won't be doing these practices here. This is for you to take home and do on your own for personal study, if it's something you wish to explore. So, Annie Besant on the mind of the masters. The consciousness of the masters stretches itself out in any direction in which they send it, assimilates itself with any point to which they direct it, knows anything which they will to know, and all this in order that they may help perfectly, that there may be nothing that they cannot feel, nothing that they cannot foster, in other words, help to grow to the next step, nothing that they cannot strengthen, nothing that they cannot aid in its evolution. To them, the whole world is one vast evolving whole, and their place in it is that of helpers of evolution. They are able to identify themselves with any step, and at that step, to give the aid that is needed. Now, this idea of being helpers of evolution, it's not easy to know what that would actually mean. I'm going to provide, as the talk continues this morning, an alternative perspective on what that could mean, and I'll explain that later. The reason I keep ending up pressing the wrong buttons is that my pointer has them in exactly the opposite position. So,
turn it around.
But then the laser's pointing at me. Is that curious? Okay, so a beginning practice, the 4 steps to unity consciousness. So these are just instructions. I'll read through them, and of course, if anybody has questions about them, I'll be happy to take them. So you can do this practice daily to develop buddhi, the perception and realization of unity consciousness within yourself. And this actually, in the Theosophical teaching, represents the next stage of the evolution of humanity. We're currently in a stage where the rational mind is the primary focus. But the next phase is the development of spiritual intuition, or buddhi. And those of us who are older souls are at the front of the wave of evolution that will eventually be moving us there. So there's no reason why we can't practice now. We'll make our own lives a lot happier, and we'll make the lives of other beings perhaps uplift them as well. So, as you know from our earlier work, the 4-step spiritual practices: show up, be fully present, be kind to yourself and others in thought, speech, feeling, and action, and find, now this is new today, find a right best next step to take in potentially mutual joy. So let me explain this concept. I went through a serious illness about 5 years ago, and I had an inner teacher who was helping me deal with it. And he said to me, if you're a human being and you're embodied in space and time, there's only one thing you can ever do, and that is take 1 step at a time. You can't take 2, you can't take 5, you can't even think about 2 or 5. The 1 step that's right in front of you. You can't let go, or you should let go of all of your concern about the past steps and whether they were right steps, and all of the future steps and how anxious the choice may be for you. And so this teacher presented me with the concept of a right best next step. So let me explain what that means. Obviously, since we live in a world of space and time, any next step will do, and we'll certainly learn something from it. Some steps bring us, and possibly others, closer to Source. And the result is joy, an expansion of unity consciousness, or a development of buddhi, or an approach to the mind of the masters. Personal or mutual relief, which is a low level of joy, means you've taken a right next step. Quiet spiritual joy means that you have taken a best next step. I think that quiet spiritual joy is not sufficiently understood. We like grand movements. We like the idea of ecstasy. But ecstasy means going beyond, beyond the body, being lifted out into some supreme bliss. Well, that's not so good for taking next steps, because it's hard to come back from that. And when we're in it, it's hard to know what our next step should be. So quiet spiritual joy is a peaceful, sometimes even blissful calmness, a clarity of mind, and a coming up to what the next step should be, where there's simply a, oh, there it is. It opens up, I take it. That was the practice that I learned in my healing process. Wait for the moment the step opens up, and then take it. Bliss, profound peace and joy, means that the greater good of all has been achieved, and you have taken a right best next step. So think about this in terms of the amount of possibilities there are. So to take a step, there's an infinite number of possibilities, and they could be of any kind: helpful, unhelpful, destructive, supportive of others, many, many different variations on that. So obviously, a right next step is going to be a much smaller number of those. And the idea is, I call it moving stuckness into flow. So in yourself or in other people, if there's a feeling that of stuckness, you can't move forward. If you can feel a way that allows you to take a step that establishes flow, then you'll feel a sense of relief. And that's the quietest kind of quiet spiritual joy, I guess you could say. So, in a similar way, among right next steps, there will also be a subdivision of those that could be called best next steps. We like to think that there's only one best next step. And oh my God, what is it? What could it be? All kinds of anxiety. But there actually may be multiple best next steps. And the idea is to feel which one of those is really the right best next step. And if we're able to do that, the way opens for us because we're open to living it. We're open to taking a step. And then there's no anxiety because we know that we're supported from inside and, in a sense, from the whole universe to take that step. Now, it should be obvious that if we're on a journey back to oneness with Source, next steps are always going to be a part of that process. Some of them take us closer to Source, some of them not so much. Some of them might be steps back. But a best next step or a right best next step or a right step, each of those in its own way, in its own degree, is going to take us closer to Source. And the amount of joy that we experience in taking that step is both the reward and the incentive to take another step in the same direction. So let's go back to this previous slide. As I said, any next step will do simply as a mode of learning and growth, and regardless of whether it brings neutral or positive or negative karma. Some steps bring us, and possibly others, closer to Source, and we're always looking for that joy. Joy is not happiness. Everyone pursues happiness, and the result of doing that is a temporary satisfaction and then a bigger thirst for more of the same, more intense of the same, or doing it all over again. And I think possibly the first lesson I learned about karma when I was a child was, if I had a great day playing with my friends and then tried to play all the same games with the same friends the next day, it never worked. That was a very bad idea. Any attempt to replicate the past happiness ends up creating dissatisfaction. And the same thing is true of joy. So a peak experience, an ecstatic experience in nature or listening to music or in a romantic relationship, the mind wants to step in and say, okay, I did A, B, C, and D, and I'm going to do A, B, C, and D again, and I'm going to get the same joy. Never works. So the thing about joy is we know it when it shows up. If we seek it, we don't find it. So I don't think there's any better way of learning how to follow joy back to Source. But for some reason, humans are either scared of or somehow feeling unworthy of the experience of joy. And so we've usually got some work to do to allow it instead of, so the difference is instead of pursuing happiness, we allow joy. Joy being our natural state of being because we are of Source. So that template, show up, be fully present, be kind to yourself and others, take a step in joy, can be applied to all areas of life as a practice, as an approach. Home and family, showing up, being fully present, being kind to yourself and the people around you, finding a step to take in joy. Same with work and friendship, same in partnership and marriage, same in organizations and groups. So there's a vast field of personal study and outer work that can be done just with those 4 steps. And you can also use this 4-step template to evaluate your progress. So let's say at the end of the day you have a habit of thinking back over the course of the day. You can easily ask yourself, did I show up? Was I fully present? Was I kind to myself and others in thought, speech, feeling, and action? Did I and or we find a step to take in joy? And that can become a basis for thinking, well, let's see if I can do better tomorrow. And then you've taken another step towards source. This template can also be the basis for meditation, though not necessarily in the way that we did it in a group. So I'm talking more about personal meditation. You can have an intention to show up, be fully present, be kind to yourself and others, and take a step in joy that you use to begin each day or week. And you can also do it, as I mentioned, as an evaluation at the end of each day or week. It's a very helpful way of sorting things out, and even beginning to process difficult or stressful circumstances. The template can also be used as the basis of problem solving and resolving arguments, in which case you might want to apply it in terms of journal writing. Write a paragraph or a page about each of the 4 steps in relationship to the challenge. It can also be a basis for conversation with colleagues, peers, friends, partners, children, and relatives. So let's say there are 2 people who are aware of this 4-step spiritual practice. If they're having a tough time, they can sit down and they can say, well, I'm having trouble showing up. Let's explore that. Or I can show up only so much. I'm not able to go beyond a certain point. I can't go to the next step of being fully present. And maybe one of the reasons for that is my experience is I'm not kind to you in my thoughts, but I also feel that you are not kind to me in your actions. And we talk about that. And then the step that's taken in mutual joy is having had a safe way to talk about difficult things and perhaps come up with a step. And in itself, the step of talking can be a step in the direction of mutual joy. So, any thoughts, feelings, ideas, comments, or questions about this basic spiritual practice and its applications? If there are no questions, I've really done a good job. So, but I am open and available because I'm really interested in people's interest in possibly exploring something like this. So any suggestions are also welcome. However, I will say I've been living out of this practice for many years now, and I tell all my students, and I tell them again, and I tell them again after that, and I tell them again after that. And I'm astonished at how they don't remember. 4 things that are so easy to remember, and they don't remember. And I think the reason is they believe that they're unique, and that the problem that they're encountering has never been encountered in the history of humanity. And it's absolutely enormous and completely crushing them, and so complex, there couldn't possibly be a solution to it, or at least not an easy one. And so the idea of a 4-step basic spiritual practice could never be applied under these circumstances. They're too special for that, you know? So really, if they ever do get it, I'm sure they'll realize what I've realized by having to live it through my healing process, that it's the best way to recognize what that teacher told me about how we can only have one step, and it's the one ahead of us. Let go of all of the past, don't worry about the future, and find and feel your way towards the joy of taking the right, best next step. Okay, we've got some questions. All right.
Thank you. You said feedback, and then you talked about how your friends and your students forget, and then I realized I'm always forgetting the same step. Now I guess I know what I have to work on.
Okay. So what you have to work on is the next step leading to joy is remembering not to forget. That's not so easy. That can be a spiritual practice in and of itself. Okay, here also.
In the last part of your explanation, you used a phrase that sort of presupposed that the person you're interacting with is familiar with this template. But I find it difficult to imagine how, for instance, I can introduce my colleagues to this template. I expect they will not be very interested. Yeah. I see how it would be very useful, but I find it hard how to make this a mutual thing.
Mm-hmm. I was primarily thinking about that in terms of partnership, because I think, there it's possible in many cases to agree that two people will adopt or play with or experiment with a framework like this. However, it usually has to be introduced when there's no charge in the relationship. You can't bring it in as a weapon at the moment that you want to get the other person to surrender. In terms of colleagues at work, the best I can say is practice that. And if anyone says to you, hey, why are you most valuable player? I don't, it's great what you do, but it's more than that. What's your secret? Then you can tell them, because they're ready for it. Kurt?
So earlier you said, to not seek joy, let's put it this way. But what if you just kind of, in this four-step process, opened to the possibility that it might show up or something like that? So it's like turning in the direction of. That makes any sense? Specifically, in difficult situations, I'm facing something that is difficult for me, and I'm starting, I start this process. I'm sure there's like a direction that I can.
Yeah, I know what you're saying. It's merely the intention, and I'll tell you. So, exactly 5 years ago, I was diagnosed with a very serious cancer, one with a very high mortality rate. And there was a very good chance I wouldn't be alive in 5 years, or even 3 years, or even 1 year. Obviously, here I am. At the beginning of this process, I said to myself, no one seems to do cancer in joy. I'm going to try. So, with a great deal of help from the other side, with a great treatment team, and also with this idea of only taking one step at a time, whatever the step was, opening up to it, letting go of the past, not worrying about the future, feeling when a step opened, following the joy that came from that, I did pretty well, I think. And I'm more joyful now than I ever was before then, and it's because it was a daily spiritual practice. And, everybody talks about the horrors of side effects from cancer treatment. The worst I experienced was hiccups for 24 hours. So somehow I did fine. So, and a lot of what I'm presenting to you right now comes directly out of that experience. So just deciding that you're going to do something that you don't want to do with joy, including life itself, if you don't feel like, and it's amazing how things open up in that direction. Any other questions or comments? So the next is an intermediate practice, and it's called the ladder of oneness, which is an extension of something Annie Besant called the ladder of lives. It's a way of thinking about levels of being and what kind of service we might be required to do for the different levels of being, and expanding our consciousness to the point where we're actually able to sense those needs and respond to them in some appropriate way. So clearly, this idea of the ladder of oneness is another step in the direction of acquiring or living from or living ourselves toward the mind of the masters. And you know, the funny thing is, that basic spiritual practice is the first step on that path as far as I'm concerned. So, you know, people who are really serious about spiritual growth should consider that something like that, even though it doesn't glitter, like the idea of initiations and transmissions and, you know, all the kinds of things that you get from certain kinds of spiritual teachers are maybe a little overrated. So here's a version, and this can be applied in the 4-step practice that was talked about in the previous beginning practice. Show up to all beings with open-minded curiosity. Be fully present to all beings with an awareness of their needs. Be kind to yourself and all beings with compassionate understanding. Find a right, best next step to take together in mutual joy or relief. Now, the word needs is a very important one here. In Buddhism, the Buddha taught that the world is a world of suffering. And the problem for Westerners is the exact meaning of that word in the Buddhist context is not the same as when we bring it into our minds and we think about suffering in what often amounts to Christian terms. And so there are a lot of things about the world of suffering and whether we should just accept it or find our way through it or be saved or rescued from it somehow. And I think what's missed in all of this is we live in a world of need. We all have needs. For as long as those needs aren't satisfied, we may be suffering to various degrees. So obviously somebody who hasn't eaten in a week is going to be suffering from starvation. At another level of being, someone who isn't getting enough personal, loving contact with other people is also deeply suffering. Or someone who feels pushed out of social organizations will be suffering. Or someone who, for example, has been following a guru, and the guru does something illegal, and the following falls apart. But there were teachings that if you left the community, you would die spiritually. Such an individual would also be suffering deeply because there was a need for spiritual community and perhaps for some reliable form of spiritual guidance. So if we think about the suffering of the world in terms of the needs of the world, suddenly it isn't quite so overwhelming. And the reason for that is any immediate need, once it's satisfied, more or less disappears from our awareness. So if you're thirsty, you take a drink of water and then you're not thirsty for a while. Whereas the idea of suffering, you know, what's going on across the world somewhere where there's a famine, that's huge and crushing to think about. And if your idea is wanting to serve humanity in some way, and you can't leave your family behind in order to go to where the famine is to feed the people who are suffering, you're suffering as a result. I know people who think this way. But of course, if you left your family, they might starve. So in a situation like that, beginning in the framework where you actually can work, just being sensitive to the needs of others is lifting the suffering of the world, even if only temporarily. And it's all that we can ever do. But there's always a step that we can take, not to lift the suffering of the world completely off of anybody, but a step to relieve them to some small extent of the suffering that they're experiencing. It might not be as easy as giving some money to someone on the street, if that's feeding their drug addiction, for example. So some kind of discernment needs to happen about what the nature of a need is and what the basis of the suffering is and whether we're equipped to do anything about it. So that person on the street struggling with a drug addiction who's asking for money and telling you they want food but won't buy food for it, there's nothing you can really do about that. It's a social system that has somehow let this person fall through the cracks. And if the person can be directed to that help and listen, that may be something. Otherwise, there has to be a continual outreach on the part of the people who are skilled in reaching such a person. And it's not that you're off the hook, it's simply that it's not your job. There's a wonderful statement in the Bhagavad Gita about Dharma. So Dharma has many, many meanings. It's truth, it's reality, it's the basis of the universe, the laws of the universe, but it's also the individual laws that guide your personal development. And the statement is, the Dharma of another is always dangerous. So what that means is, you do what you can do. You follow your own Dharma. You don't take on the Dharma of the people who are experts where you are not. I'll use an example of that. I was flying on a plane cross country in the United States some years ago, and there was a young woman who I was talking to, and she was talking about a very liberal Catholic church that was not necessarily the liberal Catholic church that we know of in the Netherlands. And she said that there was a lot of concern about various kinds of suffering going on in South America, and that the church was trying to train people, but in that context, what would happen is missionaries would go from the church, young people full of passion, and show up in Brazil saying, we want to help relieve your suffering. And the people they went to there said, go back to your own country, do something there. When you're finished with that, maybe come here. In the meantime, we're taking care of this. So I say all of this because the empath type is especially sensitive to the suffering in the world. And it's so easy for people of that type to feel overwhelmed and lose any sense of being able to take action at all, anywhere. It's a kind of depression, but it's not a personal depression. It's more a depression about the conditions of the world. So the way of healing for an empath of that kind is to start thinking about needs instead of suffering, and then to start looking for the needs of the individuals around them and what can be done. And then, as they begin to recover their energy, maybe expand or extend the range of beings that they are in touch with. And that's more a line of what I'll be talking about in this section with the ladder of oneness. So, for this practice, we climb the ladder of oneness by applying the basic practice to each of these levels. So essentially, these levels are the ladder of oneness. We climb this ladder by applying the basic practice to each of these levels. We start with things, which is related to the mineral kingdom. If everything is conscious, everything you own is conscious. So how are you taking care of that? Are you neglecting them? Do they have needs that you may or may not be fulfilling? We all have cars, or most of us do anyway. Cars have needs. If you don't know that you need to have the oil changed, the car essentially is destroyed. So if you think of the car as a system, because it's too hard to think of it as a being, you still have to think of the system having needs that you're responsible for. And this can be true of all the things in your apartment that are getting covered with dust. They need to be cared for also, especially because anything that you love deeply becomes one of those astral birdhouses I was talking about last night. It starts to show up on the astral plane. A deva can come in, and the result is there's a great feeling of peace that is spread throughout your living space. Some of you may have had that experience. People come into your place and they say, it's so peaceful here. And it's not necessarily because you're in living in nature. You can have that experience in the city too. People often tell me that when they come to my place. But when dust covers things, that connection to the Deva world is not being sustained. And as a result, whatever help you're getting from there starts to diminish. So it's important to think about the care of our things, and also to think that if we have more things than we can care for properly, maybe it's time to start moving them on somewhere else. The next higher level of the ladder of oneness can include houseplants or a garden as representatives of the vegetable kingdom. One of the first things I learned how to do when I was in college around developing clairvoyant abilities was listening to the houseplants when I went into someone's house, because they would tell me about their owners and how helpful or neglectful they were. Some of that, of course, you could see in the state of the plant, but the plants were sometimes very strong about it. You know, there was definitely a feeling of being resentful, because of course they couldn't walk across the apartment to get a drink of water, right? And then extending this to the animal kingdom. So for example, butterflies and birds. There are a lot of people who plant butterfly gardens to attract them, or put out bird houses or bird feeders, household pets and farm creatures. All of these are beings that have needs that we may be responsible for in one way or another. With the wild butterflies, it's being responsible for making sure that they have the food that they need by recreating the environment in our garden that is being destroyed someplace else. And then the human kingdom, all ages of people, from infants to elderly. What can we think of in terms of them and their needs and how they may be suffering? An old person can be suffering because no one ever talks to them. They live in a little apartment in a retirement community, and maybe their family lives far away. My mother is 92 years old, and she makes visits to people like that in her community, with the knowledge that they may be lonely. And sometimes she hears an earful of complaints, and sometimes she hears the same story she heard the last 5 times, but she continues to make her rounds, and good for her, 92. So, and you know, infants, obviously, in a great state of need and often suffering and loud complaining about that. We learn how to deal with those too, and perhaps as grandparents or aunts and uncles, we have more freedom in a way to do that than parents do, who can sometimes be overtaxed with all that is required of them. So then there's the Deva kingdom. Now, again, going back to the charts of yesterday, in the center where there was the arrow, we had all of the levels I've just been talking about on the left side of the column, and on the right side, we had all the invisible or non-physical beings, including the Deva kingdom. We can include these on our ladder of oneness, and they have their own particular ladder. So we can show that we're ready to climb the ladder of oneness within the Deva kingdom by feeling joy and gratitude for the following items. You know, the old traditions about the Deva kingdom, in particular fairies, were that you needed to leave some milk for them, or a little butter, or there's even a tradition still in the United States. Santa Claus comes down the chimney to give the gifts to the children on Christmas Day, and so you leave some Christmas cookies and a glass of milk out for Santa Claus. So all of these things, and you know, we did that when I was a child, and they were always eaten and drunk by the time we got up in the morning. So these are symbols of what really feeds the Deva kingdom. It's our acknowledgement of their presence. It's our gratitude for what they can do for us. It's funny, I think there are very few human beings who could say, I can live on gratitude alone. And yet the Devas, that's all they need from us, because it creates a link, and that link makes possible collaboration between the two levels of being, two evolutions. So we have elementals that maintain the health of our body, feelings, mind, and soul. These elementals are actually the energy bodies. Our consciousness in Theosophy occupies a physical body, obviously, but also an astral body, and that astral body essentially is a conscious being from the Deva world called an elemental. And we have a physical elemental, a mental elemental, an emotional elemental, and a spiritual elemental. And they're a little like horses. If we feed them well, they do exactly what we need, joyfully, but we have to guide them a little bit. And if we don't feed them, they misbehave. So in my classes, I've developed some practices around working with elementals. And we've learned that the physical elemental needs quality sense experience. So good food, good exercise, good contact with nature, good sensual or romantic contact. All of these things feed it. But if it doesn't get these things, then it creates addictions. And the addictions are always to a harmful form of any of these things. And the basis really at the physical level is what that elemental most needs is, in a sense, body-to-body contact. So a hug, for example, is pleasing to that elemental. And along those lines, I remember a massage therapist, probably quoting from another massage therapist, saying, the greatest disease of the body is not being touched. And I think that's worthy of consideration in the light of elementals. So your astral or emotional elemental deals with the emotional level of your being. It needs heart-to-heart contact with others. If it doesn't get that, it misbehaves. And the way that it misbehaves is huge operatic emotional trauma that is enacted for your benefit as the audience. We all know people, sometimes in families, sometimes in the office, or colleagues at work. They're lovely people, and then little by little bit, tension builds. And it starts to feel like a thunderstorm is coming. And if you know them, you know you don't want to be there when the lightning strikes. But then when the lightning strikes and you happen to be hit by it, there's a huge yelling, discussion. You're completely shaken and traumatized by it. and they go back to being their usual peaceful, loving self, and often don't even know that they had this effect on you. That's what happens when the emotional elemental doesn't get what it needs. The mental elemental needs people who share your beliefs and values. It needs mind-to-mind contact. We're having that here. Our mental elementals are happy with this. When they're not happy, they argue a lot, and they have strong opinions, and they are absolutely the only one who's right in everything. Or they withdraw completely from the world into isolated intellectual pursuits. That can be anything from surfing the internet for useless information or playing computer games, that sort of thing. And then the causal, or spiritual elemental, this one is not talked about in Theosophy, but it has come up in my classes. It is all about soul-to-soul contact, and it needs to have the feeling of being useful in the world and being with and working with others who are useful in the world. So an organization like the Theosophical Society can feed this level of people's being. When it doesn't have that feeling of usefulness, it gives up. It gets depressed. It can't get out of bed. This can be so serious that when I say it, you can't get out of bed, what I mean is you can't even lift your hand to start the process of getting out of bed. That's how serious the depression is when it comes from this level. Now, I think I've diagnosed every problem of society: addiction, emotional discharges, mental bigotry, and depression over a feeling of uselessness. All of this can be turned around by caring properly for our elementals. So it's not even, in a sense, a human problem in the way that we think about it. It's a problem of our connection to the Deva world. So as long as we're feeding those elementals in the ways that I suggested, they're happy and they're horses and they do exactly what we direct them to do. There is information in some theosophical literature about how to work with the elementals. Leadbeater talks in particular about the desire elemental, which is the astral elemental. And there's a little bit about that in At the Feet of the Master also. But we can extend this, going up the ladder of oneness, to the beings in the stones, the trees, the rivers, the lakes, the winds, the clouds, the colors and light, the landscapes. Essentially, these are expressions of nature's spirits and the devas of the elements. Stones, obviously, those are the gnome level being. Trees, that's sort of a hybrid, but dryads like the one I was talking about last night, the elf that's in the tree over near the elf meadow. And the rivers and lakes, those are the water beings. The winds and the clouds, those are the air beings. Colors and light, those are the fire beings. And then landscapes are much larger conglomerates of all of these put together. So just being grateful out in nature for all of these things is helpful and supports the Deva kingdom and also creates a rapport and a possibility of communication and collaboration. So if you want to imagine that you're an ancient Greek or an ancient Druid or something of that nature, when you're out in the world just responding to everything around you as a being, it might be that those beings will start to see you and then they'll start to show themselves to you. The first time that happened for me was quite surprising because I didn't have any context for understanding it. I was in university and I went to a place that my brother had told me about, a natural area. It had the name Old Man's Cave. And the cave wasn't really a cave, it was just a deep place underneath a cliff that an old man had lived in. back in the 1800s. So I was walking down the path. It was between winter and spring, so the leaves weren't out yet. And there were lots of old leaves and some snow on the ground. And as I was walking along the path, all of a sudden, a being about this high ran past me. And I stopped because I saw it, but I could also see through it. And then it stopped because I stopped. So it was looking at me and I was looking at it. And then it started almost doing a little dance. It moved to one side to see if I followed it, and then it moved to the other side, and then forward and back, and then eventually I lost sight of it. I always remembered that experience because I didn't know what it could be. And in a sense, it wasn't until I began reading about nature spirits and devas in the Theosophical teachings that I understood what that was. It wasn't exactly something I could talk about to my friends. I couldn't even say to them, I saw an elf in the woods. Not because they wouldn't understand it, but because I didn't know what it was. So probably a no of some kind. But the thing is, they show themselves because they want to communicate and because they see that there's a possibility of it. And gratitude is an opening for that. You can also feel joy and gratitude for support in research and creative work. And that means mental plane devas, inspiration devas, I'm calling them. If you're a creative artist and suddenly everything is flowing and full of inspiration and there's a sense of joy that's carrying you along, you're probably getting some support from an inspiration deva. The characteristics of devas are they exist outside of space and time, and they have this very pure joy of being. And when you feel that joy of being, it's very uplifting, very exalting. It can get addictive. And so we have to be careful sometimes about our connection with the devas. But if I'm working on a piece of music and it's going really, really well, I am grateful for that. And sometimes I'm even aware of the inspiration deva, and occasionally I've even met it in the dream. Coming into my dream and saying, hey, I was the one that helped you, showing themselves. So here's another set of instructions about how to work with the devas. Know that when you are ready, whatever training you need to see, hear, and understand invisible beings, to communicate and collaborate with them, or fulfill a task or mission for them, it will develop naturally and organically. As they begin to show up for you, be fully present with you, be kind to themselves and you, and find a step to take in joy with you. So, the reason that I reworded the 4-step spiritual practice here is, when we're doing it, we show up, they know they'll be treated well. They then start to show up for us. So, once again, that basic spiritual practice that all of my students forget is the gateway to the one thing they most want to do, which is work with the devas and nature spirits. Go figure. And when I said invisible beings on the previous slide, I didn't just mean the devas, but deceased humans, higher devas, masters, and inner teachers. And I'll have a few more slides with this, and then we'll take a break, and then the advanced practice will be after the break. So, about spiritual guidance, Annie Besant had this to say. The masters ever watch the race, the human race, and mark any who by the practice of virtue, by unselfish labor for human good, by intellectual effort turned to the service of humanity, by sincere devotion, piety, and purity. I'm going to go back just a second before I go on. I think all this is covered by the basic spiritual practice. So, this can sound like a tall order to follow, but when she talks about practice of virtue, kindness to all beings is certainly the highest of those virtues. When such a person draws ahead of the mass of their fellow beings and render themselves capable of receiving spiritual assistance beyond that shed down on mankind as a whole, if an individual is to receive help, he must show special receptivity. So essentially what I'm talking about in climbing this ladder of oneness is how we develop and show special receptivity so that as we expand the areas, levels of being that we're offering service to, we're supported by teaching that helps us develop the abilities we need in order to do that. So it's not a question of, I want to see an elf. It's a question of, I'm being in service to humanity, and I want to be in service of nature, and I want to be grateful for all the beings around me, and I know that that's one way of being kind to them, and I'll just do this. I won't do it for any purpose, but I'll just keep doing it, and I'll follow my joy, I'll follow my joy. And if all of a sudden there's a big joy that shows up, as in the experience that Aaron told on the first night, then you know the devas are watching and they're letting you know. They see you when you're doing something, or you're involved in something that they approve of. And who knows, that could be a step, a first step in a continuing relationship with devas. That comes from Annie Besant's The Ancient Wisdom. So what about spiritual guidance? This is not an easy topic to talk about in the Theosophical Society. The reason is, I believe, that there's a deep confusion about the nature of mediumship. Madame Blavatsky wrote very explicitly against mediumship, but she was writing against a specific kind, the kind that caused tables to move and things to appear that weren't there before, or that were moved from one room to another room without explanation. All of those things supposedly were caused by elemental beings, not non-physical beings, but were attributed to grandma, in the way I was talking about before. As I mentioned, Blavatsky claimed that that was not a very intelligent way of dealing with the invisible beings, and spiritualists didn't want to hear they were not very intelligent, so they pushed Blavatsky out. And she established the Theosophical Society to expand the range of understanding about the invisible worlds. But at the same time, what we've carried forward from that is any relationship with the invisible worlds is taboo, because it might involve mediumship, or as it's called now, channeling. However, the simplest way to open ourselves up to spiritual guidance is through any kind of meditation. We can also do it by writing about the following completely open-ended questions. So really it's more about just being open, but I'll have some cautions to talk about in a moment. And also I'm going to show you a quotation from Blavatsky that seems to approve. So the two questions are, what do I need to know right now, and what do I need to do with what I know? In all the work I've done over 25 years, nearly 25 years of teaching people about psychic and spiritual development, if you come to the inner worlds with two completely open-ended questions of no expectations, you might start to get some helpful answers. What do I need to know right now? But not just knowing it. What do I need to do with what I know? How can I take action on it? Obviously, if it's a completely unreasonable thing that you need to know and the action would be impossible or dangerous, that's not a helpful guide. So here's what Madame Blavatsky had to say about spiritual guidance. I have to tell you, one of the greatest experiences of my life as a theosophist was reading all the way through Blavatsky's collected writings. They are ignored, I think, partially because they're not in every language, There are only in a few others besides English. Also because there are 14 volumes and they range from 400 to 600 pages, although the print is fairly large. I did it in 9 months, and I wasn't doing it 24 hours a day. They were so fascinating, and I learned so much about her worldview and personality. But in the middle of this, I found a statement that absolutely floored me or shocked me. And here it is. Oops. Subjective, purely spiritual, so-called, quotation marks, mediumship is the only harmless kind and is often an elevating gift that might be cultivated by everyone. That comes from the 6th volume of the collected writings. It's the last paragraph of a review of a book that no one would ever be interested in these days. So I want this to be brought to people's attention. I've had this experience. I've been working with an inner teacher along those lines for 40 years, and it is subjective in the sense that it's inner. It's not involved with moving things around in the outside world. It is spiritual in the sense that I'm confident that I'm speaking with a being who is in some respects more advanced than I am. It has not been harmless, it's been elevating. It got me through the cancer diagnosis and treatment that I told you about. And it has definitely been an elevating gift. And I can say, I feel fairly certain it can be cultivated by anyone who has the interest. It has to be done safely, and so I have a few slides to say about that too. So Annie Besant had this to say on discernment, and in this area, discernment means how to know the difference between messages from lower and higher beings. A personal wish reflected back by the desire-based forces of the astral plane brings impatience, hurry, excitement, and anger if the carrying code is opposed. So in other words, if the being you're communicating with gets bossy, not good, lower being, trying to be a higher being. Also, the sense of urgency. How many people who first learn to open up to spiritual guidance get a message about saving the world and then drop everything they're doing and then get into all kinds of trouble? So that was also not a message that came from a reliable being. A spiritual impulse from higher beings, including the masters, brings utter absence of excitement and passion of any kind, and devotion, calm, and patience. In other words, what I was talking about earlier as quiet spiritual joy. If it's loud spiritual joy, I would be suspicious, but quiet spiritual joy, that's the way to go. This is in my compilation of Annie Besant's writings on psychic and spiritual development, Invisible Worlds. So then Annie Besant had this to say on how clairvoyant powers may be developed safely. There is no safety in it, except a constant effort to use every power you already have in the service of others. Then, if you habitually use all you have to help, more power will be gained gradually by you. Through the assistance of those, in other words, the masters, who see that you are using well what you already have. So, as we climb this ladder of lives, or ladder of oneness, we're trying to be of service at each level. When we've gotten to the point where we can't go any farther without some form of higher powers, that might develop. But it might be very, very simple. It might be knowing one of your pet animals' needs, simply telepathically. And the thing is, if you can do it with a pet, you might be able to do it with someone else. So for example, my friends, when I see them and haven't seen them for a while, we give each other an embrace, and instantly, without my doing anything about it, I know about their mood and whatever their troubles are. I mean, not specifically, but I know if they're troubled or not, and I'll say something to them about it, and that opens the way for a conversation. And because we deal with it first thing then there's time for happiness and joy and so on. Instead of what usually happens, which is, I don't want anyone to know about my problems, I don't want anyone, my special friend to help me because I've been helped by him so many times, or whatever, all of the self-talk that we do that is negative. That comes from a book called Some American Lectures. So let's take our break now. Perhaps at the beginning of the next segment, we can do some questions about this particular practice. So think about whether you've got any.